Welcome to part 5 of this series on the visual effects available in the free version of Hitfilm. This time I want to deal with the final 2 effects in the blur collection. There are a total of 8 effects in this collection, and I covered 5 of them in part 4. One of the 8, the bilateral blur, is only available in the Pro or Creator versions of Hitfilm. The final 2 effects described in this part are the motion blur and lens blur effects. Motion blur detects movement using optical flow techniques, then applies artificial motion blur to that movement. It uses the distance that specific features move from one frame to the next to achieve the motion blur. The motion blur effect can be applied either to an event on the editor timeline or to a video layer on a composite shot timeline. To demonstrate this effect, I've placed a video showing runners passing a stationary camera onto the editor timeline. I've then applied the motion blur effect in the controls section. The effect initially has 6 parameters, 5 of them contained within the optical flow section. The parameter labelled Mode has 3 settings, accessed by clicking the drop-down arrow. The default setting is Comp Settings. To explain this, I'm going to convert the event on the timeline to a composite shot. Now I'll select the composite shot properties. The 3 main motion blur settings can be found under the Advanced tab. So, the mode parameter set at Comp Settings is only valid when the effect is applied to a composite shot. Having said that, back to the original situation. The 2 other settings are Off, which obviously disables the effect, and Custom, which enables the 3 main parameters. As you can see, the default custom parameters create a small amount of blur on the legs in the middle of the frame. Let's look at each of the 3 main parameters in detail. The photographers amongst you will recognize the first 2 parameters. The shutter angle equates to the duration that the shutter is open on a real camera. The bigger the angle, the longer the shutter is open, which produces more blur. I can demonstrate this by doubling the angle. This produces a more pronounced blur. A shutter angle of 0 will produce no blur. You'll notice that, although the main character's legs have a strong blur, the legs of the man at the top left have little. This is because he is moving towards the camera and his relative movement is small. The man in the middle is moving almost across the field of view, so his relative movement is large. The shutter phase parameter determines where the blur occurs in relation to the original video frame. A positive value places the blur behind the movement. A negative value places the blur in front. It is recommended that this setting should be half that of the shutter angle setting. The sample setting determines how many samples are taken over a given number of frames to determine the quality of the blur. A higher number produces a better quality of blur than a lower number, but the trade-off is a longer rendering time. Moving on to the optical flow section. The parameter descriptions in this section are way beyond the scope of this tutorial. My knowledge of optical flow techniques is very limited anyway. My advice is to leave these settings at default, unless of course you are knowledgeable about optical flow. The lens blur effect attempts to mimic the bokeh effect which can be created by a camera's lens. One of the definitions of bokeh, according to Wikipedia, is, quote, the way the lens renders out of focus points of light, unquote. Because of this, the lens blur effect needs to first make the scene out of focus. On scenes that have a fixed focal length, that's not a problem, as everything could normally be out of focus. However, where a scene contains an object near to the camera, it's not desirable to have that object out of focus. To remedy this, it's necessary to mask out areas that shouldn't be out of focus. There are two ways of doing this, a simple way and a complex way. After I've dealt with the parameter descriptions, I'll demonstrate a simple scenario where the whole scene being out of focus isn't a problem. I'll then demonstrate the other scenario where the object in the foreground needs to be in focus. I'll describe the complex way of achieving this first, which involves using a depth map, then the easy way. Note that the lens blur effect is the one effect in the blur collection that can't be applied to an event on the editor timeline. It must be applied to a composite shot. The main section of the effect has two options and 6 parameters. I'm going to leave the 2 options for now. Their usage will become apparent when I describe the depth map. The radius parameter, as with other blur effects, determines the strength of the blur. The next 2 parameters will be familiar to the photographers amongst you. Focal distance allows you to rack focus based on a depth map. For those unfamiliar with the term rack focus, it's a method where the area in focus throughout a scene changes. I won't be dealing with rack focus in this tutorial. Focal range determines the depth of field. In a 2-dimensional situation such as this, it can't produce the expected results. Going from 0 to maximum simply makes the whole frame come into focus. The specular threshold parameter affects the bright areas of a scene. Depending upon the parameter value, certain bright areas will be blown out to white. Decreasing this value will blow out more less bright areas. This parameter works in conjunction with the specular brightness parameter. The specular brightness parameter will determine the brightness of any highlights in the scene. The bokeh produced by bright lights can be enhanced using a combination of this parameter and the specular threshold parameter. The quality parameter determines the quality of the blur. I gave an explanation of this in part 4 when I described the zoom blur effect. The iris section has parameters that determine how any bokehs that are created will appear. Before describing the parameters, I need to select the View Iris checkbox. This displays a pictorial representation of how any bokehs generated will look. The shape parameter determines the shape of the bokeh. There are 9 shapes to choose from. The different shapes are self-evident, with the more sided shapes creating a less well-defined bokeh. The shape called fast square, though, is a bit of a mystery. This produces a large square bokeh and disables all the iris parameters except the rotation parameter. This means it's not possible to customize the fast square shape. The rotation parameter allows the bokeh to be rotated. As with other parameters that have a circle next to the name, the rotation parameter can be used to animate the bokeh. It has two values, a unit degree value and a 360-degree modifier. When used for animation, a value increase will create a clockwise motion and a value decrease will produce an anti-clockwise motion. The curvature parameter allows customization of the bokeh shape's side. A negative value will produce an inward curve and a positive value an outward one. A value of 1 results in a circle, irrespective of the shape chosen. The pinch parameter affects the curvature of any curved section. Adjustment of this value will make curves shallower or fuller. The shift value causes the center of any curved section to be offset. The opacity curve parameter produces a highlighted feathered circle. Adjusting the value will adjust the density of the feathering. Taken to its maximum value, it will produce a circular highlight, but this is dependent upon the highlight location parameter's value. The highlight location parameter determines where the highlight occurs within the bokeh. So that's the parameters dealt with. Now let's see how the effect works. It works best on an event that's fully in focus and has small points of light. I've imported a video of moving stars and converted it into a composite shot. I'll now apply the lens blur effect. To create the bokeh effect on the small points of light, I need to set the specular threshold to 0.9 and the specular brightness to 50. Now, This is where the iris parameters come into play. As an example of what can be achieved, I'll set the opacity curve to 6 and make sure that the highlight position is 1. Now to see the result. I'll now disable the effect to show the difference. So that's the effect applied to a video that's fully in focus and has small points of light. As I mentioned earlier, the situation where an object is in the foreground can be tackled in one of two ways. One method is fairly simple, and the other is fairly complex. I'll describe the complex method first. This method involves using a depth map to isolate an area or areas that need to be in focus. For this example, I'm going to use a depth map consisting of a black area and a white area. I'm using a video of a man observing city lights. I first need to apply the lens blur effect. With all the parameters at default, a blur has been applied to the image. To create the bokeh effect on the city lights, I first need to adjust the specular threshold downwards. I now need to increase the specular brightness. You can see that the lights have become larger and brighter. The default shape of the iris, and therefore the bokehs, is an octagon. I'm going to leave it at that, but I want to make a few changes to the bokeh's appearance, so I'll select the View Iris checkbox. I can get the effect I want by setting the opacity curve to 25. As you can see, the style of the bokehs have changed. By adjusting the iris parameters, you can achieve some interesting results. The next thing to do is to create another composite shot of the video. I'll call this Map. I now have to add a new plane layer. This will be black. Now I need to apply a mask to the plane layer to mask out the man in the foreground. I'll hide the plane layer so that I can see what I'm doing when I draw the mask. With the man now visible, I'll proceed to draw the mask. I explained in detail how masks are drawn in tutorials 84, 85 and 86. Now that the mask is drawn, I can make the plane layer visible. You can see that the man and any unimportant detail has been masked out of the original scene. Now I need to create a white background to the black mask. I do this by creating a white plane layer and placing it underneath the black plane layer. I now need to select the original composite on the timeline, then pull the new composite from the media panel underneath it. In the lens blur properties, I'll set the source layer to be the map composite. Now I have to set the blend mode to luminance. Finally, I'll set the focal distance to minimum. Because the map composite is the source layer, and because the source channel is luminance, the masked out area isn't affected by the blur. You will notice, though, a ghosting effect around the man. This is an unfortunate consequence of using the lens blur with a mask. You can mitigate the effect a little by winding the focal range upwards. If you wind it up too far, though, you will lose the bokeh effect. Now for the fairly simple method, which doesn't require a depth map. I'm using the same video in a composite shot and I'll duplicate it. I now need to create a mask on the top video layer. Again, this mask will be drawn around the foreground objects. I've not spent as much time on this mask. How much time you spend on your mask depends upon how accurate you want to be and how complex the shape is. With the mask created, I can now apply the lens blur effect to the bottom layer. I'm going to use the same parameter values as I did in the first method. So there you have it, two methods of achieving the same result. I'll leave you to decide which is the simplest. The advantage of using a depth map is when the scene requires the blur to be graded. This is achieved by applying a black and white gradient to the plane layer in the map composite. The blur will be graded from full blur on the whiter parts of the gradient and no blur at the black end. One final point. When using a mask to mask out the object in the foreground, no further action is required if it's a single frame or an image that's being processed. However, if a video is to be processed, rotoscoping must be used to ensure that the mask follows the movement and shape of the foreground object. I described simple rotoscoping in tutorial 86. That concludes this mini-series on the blur collection. With some imagination and a knowledge of keyframing, the effects in this collection can be very useful. Join me next time when I'll be delving into more of the many visual effects available in the free version of Hitfilm. In the meantime, please consider subscribing. I'll also welcome any comments that you may have. Until the next time, bye for now.